800 years ago, in medieval England, two children with bright green skin emerged from underground wolf pits speaking an impossible language. They claimed to come from St. Martin's Land, where the sun never rises and everyone has green skin. The boy died within weeks, but the girl lived to tell her story. Here's what makes this terrifying. Identical green children appeared across Europe for centuries. Always two. Always the same story. Always the boy dies while the girl survives. This isn't folklore, it's documented history that challenges everything we think we know about reality. The year of our Lord, 1130-something, the scribes no longer bothered with precision when recording such things. For what did exact dates matter when time itself seemed broken? Late summer brought a harvest moon that hung in Suffolk's sky like a bruised eye, watching over a kingdom that had forgotten how to bleed cleanly. King Stephen and his cousin, the Empress Matilda, had been tearing England apart for 15 years now. Their civil war, a cancer that fed on itself, growing stronger with each village burned, each brother pitted against brother, each harvest left to rot while men who should have been reaping grain instead reaped each other with sword and mace. They called it the anarchy, though that word was too small, too neat for the sprawling catastrophe that had swallowed a realm. Anarchy suggested chaos, but this was worse. This was order turned inside out. A kingdom devouring its own entrails with the methodical precision of a snake consuming its tail. Suffolk sat far from the great battles, where earls carved up the map with their ambitions. Yet distance was no protection from consequence. The war's hunger reached everywhere, even into these quiet corners, where monks still copied manuscripts and farmers still turned furrows when they could find seed worth planting. Refugees drifted through the villages like living ghosts, speaking languages no one recognized. Flemish weavers fleeing their own wars. Norman soldiers deserting causes they no longer remembered. Saxon peasants driven from holdings their grandfathers had worked since the conquest. All displaced, all seeking something that might once have been called home. Woolpit village nestled between two worlds. Behind it lay the ancient wolf-trapping pits that gave the settlement its name. Roman work, some claimed, though others insisted the Saxons had dug them in the deep times before memory. Before it rose the mighty abbey of Bury St. Edmunds, the most powerful religious house in all East Anglia, whose bells could be heard on clear mornings when the wind ran true. The abbey should have investigated any wonder or horror that occurred within their domain. Such was both their privilege and their burden. Yet when true wonder came, when the impossible pressed itself against the everyday like a blade against silk, the great abbey would remain strangely, troublingly silent. The harvest proceeded that September, under omens that made even the youngest field hands cross themselves. In June, a two-headed calf had been born to Godwin Miller's best cow, born alive, nursed for 3 days, then died with both mouths open in what might have been a scream. The carcass was burned without blessing, for what priest could say which head should receive last rites? Since midsummer, lights had danced above the marshlands on moonless nights, cold fires that obeyed no natural law, vanishing when approached but returning the moment watchers turned away. Father Benedict had led 3 processions with holy water and burning incense, yet the lights persisted, and after each failed exorcism, the priest's hair had grown whiter, his hands more tremulous when he raised the host. The old women of Woolpit, those repositories of memory who recalled when King Henry ruled with an iron fist and the realm knew peace, however brutal, muttered about thin veils and doors that should stay closed. They spoke of times when the world was younger, and the boundaries between what was and what should not be had been drawn with different hands using different inks. They remembered stories their grandmothers had whispered of places where the earth grew restless, where ancient powers stirred in their sleep, where the very ground might crack open to reveal chambers that had no business existing in a Christian land. Near the wolf pits, where the soil was richest and the grain grew tallest, something was amiss. The wheat that sprouted there gleamed with an odd sheen, green gold like pond water touched by summer light. It grew higher than wheat had any right to grow, the stalks thick as a man's thumb, the grain heads heavy enough to bow the strongest stems toward earth, that exhaled a sweetness like honey mixed with copper. Godric the ploughman claimed the very furrows seemed to pulse beneath his blade, as though something beneath the surface kept time with a heart too large for any mortal chest. It was there, on the morning when the harvest moon still hung pale in a sky the colour of old pewter, that the reapers paused in their work. The sound came from below, a crying that spoke of grief too deep for words, too pure for artifice. Not the wail of wind through stone, not the call of some lost creature, but something that pulled at the listeners' souls like a tide pulls at the shore. Young Edmund dropped his scythe, the blade ringing against a stone buried in the earth since Saxon times. Old Marta set down her gleaning basket, the grain spilling golden across ground that suddenly seemed to thrum with possibility. Even Walter Reeve, who had served 3 lords and trusted none of them, left his accounting and walked toward the sound as if called by a name he had forgotten he possessed. The crying grew stronger as they approached the largest of the wolf pits, drawing them forward with something that was not quite compulsion, but was more than mere curiosity. It spoke to that part of the human spirit that remembers when the world was wider, when the boundaries between the seen and unseen were thinner than morning mist, when children might step through doorways that led to places that had no names in any earthly tongue. What they would find in the depths of that ancient pit would challenge everything they thought they knew about the nature of the world, about the limits of God's creation, about the boundaries that separate the possible from the impossible. But in this moment, as they stood on the edge of wonder, they were still ordinary people living in ordinary time, governed by ordinary laws. That was about to change forever. The crying rose from the earth like a prayer offered in reverse, and those who heard it felt something shift in the foundations of reality itself, as though the world had just remembered a secret it had been trying to forget. Like driftwood claimed by the tide, they were carried forward by the sound of crying, both irresistible and eerie. Men froze in their fields, blades slipping from their grasp to strike stone with dull music. Women abandoned their loaves to blacken in the ovens, the stench of char wafting through the morning fog, as the village surged toward the wolf pit, answering a cry like morning given breath. They came from the fields and cottages, from the mill where the miller had been grinding the early grain, from the church where the priest had been preparing for afternoon prayers. Even the children followed, though their mothers tried to hold them back, with hands that trembled for reasons they could not name. Something in that sound, not quite human, not quite animal, but achingly familiar, spoke to the deepest parts of their souls, the places where memory lives before words can shape it. At the edge of the largest pit, they stopped as one body, as though some invisible boundary had been drawn in the air itself. The crying rose more clearly now, and with it came other sounds. The scrape of small bodies against earth, the whisper of fabric against stone, words spoken in a tongue that flowed like water over smooth pebbles, like wind through caves that had never known sunlight. A young reaper whose hands bore scars from 20 years of harvest was the first to lean forward and peer into the depths. What he saw there would follow him to his deathbed 30 years hence, appearing in dreams that left him gasping and reaching for his wife's warmth in the dark hours before dawn. Two small figures pressed against the earthen walls of the pit, their arms wrapped around each other with the desperate tenderness of the utterly lost. Children, surely. The boy, perhaps 7 summers. His sister, younger still. Yet children unlike any that had ever drawn breath in England or any Christian land. Their skin glowed with the colour of spring leaves touched by morning light, of copper left too long in water, of things that grow in the deep places where sun has never reached. Not paint, not dye, not the jaundice that sometimes yellowed infants born too soon, but colour that seemed to emanate from within, as though their very blood ran green as the sap of young trees. The boy shielded his sister with arms that trembled not just from fear, but from something deeper, the exhaustion of those who have travelled too far from whatever place they called home. His eyes, when they caught the light filtering down through the pit's mouth, were the green of deep forest pools, ancient and knowing, in ways that made grown men step back from the edge. They babbled in their water tongue, words that seemed to flow and eddy around meanings just beyond comprehension. Not Norman French with its harsh consonants and martial rhythms, not Saxon English with its earth-heavy vowels, not Latin with its measured cadences of prayer and law, not even the Flemish of those strange weavers who had arrived from across the narrow sea, fleeing their own wars with bundles of foreign cloth and incomprehensible complaints. This language was older. It sounded like streams running over stones worn smooth by centuries of patient water, like wind moving through chambers carved by hands that had never known the touch of iron. When the girl spoke, her voice higher, more musical than her brother's, some of the listeners felt tears start in their eyes for reasons they could not fathom. An old woman crossed herself and whispered a prayer to Saint Christopher, patron of travellers, though she could not have said why. These children seemed less like arrivals than like something that had always been there, waiting in the earth's dark places until some door had finally opened to release them into the harsh light of a world they were never meant to see. Slowly and warily the Reaper extended his scarred hands, the way one approaches creatures too quick to trust. The children shrank back against the pit's wall, pressing themselves into the earth as if they might disappear, back into whatever realm had birthed them. But the girl, brave or desperate, or simply too young to understand the full measure of their strangeness, reached up with fingers that shook like autumn leaves. That first contact between their worlds felt like lightning contained in flesh. Her green-tinged palm pressed against the Reaper's work-hardened knuckles, and something passed between them. Not words, not thoughts, but recognition. She was real. She was afraid. She was impossibly, undeniably here. He lifted her first, his movements gentle as any father's, though his own daughters had been cold in the churchyard these 10 years. She weighed almost nothing, this child made of mystery and morning light, her body seeming to hold no more substance than shadow or sea foam. The boy came next, allowing himself to be drawn up only when his sister called to him in their liquid tongue, her voice carrying assurances that required no translation. Lifted into the blazing noon sun, they covered their eyes and wailed as though the light itself was poison. The sound that rose from their throats was pure anguish, the cry of creatures torn from their proper element and thrust into a realm where they could not survive. Some of the watchers fled then, crossing themselves and muttering prayers against demons and changelings. Others knelt in the dirt, uncertain whether they witnessed miracle or damnation, but recognizing the presence of power beyond their understanding. Pushing through the mass of bodies, the priest appeared with hair disheveled from his dash, vestments thrown hurriedly over the coarse garment of his solitude. He spoke the Latin that made demons reveal themselves, the words of binding and banishment that had served holy men since Patrick drove the serpents from Ireland. The children merely blinked their impossible green eyes and cried harder, clinging to each other as though they were all that remained of a world that had somehow misplaced them. They seemed to see through the priest's ritual words to something deeper, some essential kindness or cruelty that Latin could not disguise. In their tears, in their terror, in their absolute alienness, they were unmistakably, heartbreakingly young. Whatever they were, wherever they had come from, they were children first, lost, frightened, and far from any home that mortal geography could contain. As the crowd pressed closer, reaching out with hands that sought to touch miracle or madness, the green children held each other and spoke in their water language, their voices weaving together in harmonies that seemed to call to something that had no name in any earthly tongue. Woolpit awoke to the impossible on a Tuesday like any other, though no day afterward could ever be like any other. Word reached Sir Richard de Calne within the hour, his fastest rider destroying 3 horses in the desperate gallop from Woolpit to the Manor Hall, where the Norman lord held court over lands that Saxon hands had worked since before the conquest. The messenger arrived foam-flecked and wild-eyed, his mount's flanks heaving like bellows as he stumbled into the great hall, with news that defied reason itself. 2 children, green as spring leaves, speaking no Christian tongue, found in the ancient wolf pits like foundlings dropped from another world entirely. Sir Richard received this intelligence with the calculated stillness that had kept him alive through 15 years of civil war. While other Norman lords had chosen sides and died for their choices, he had survived through careful neutrality and an understanding that in times of chaos, mystery held more power than any sword. A man who controlled wonders controlled something more valuable than gold or grain. He controlled the stories that would outlive kingdoms. His great hall filled quickly with voices that competed like merchants at market. The household chaplain, Brother Francis, demanded immediate exorcism. Surely these were demons testing Christian faith, sent by the enemy to corrupt the faithful through false miracles. His Latin flowed in urgent streams, scriptural passages about discernment of spirits, warnings against the deceiver who appeared as an angel of light. The reeve wanted them drowned as changelings before they could curse the harvest. Such things had happened before, he insisted, his weathered face grave with remembered terrors. Fairy children swapped for human babies, bringing blight to the fields and madness to the households that sheltered them. Best to end this quickly, before whatever power had sent them realized their location. Merchants from London, present to negotiate the sale of the manor's wool crop, offered gold for such curiosities. Their eyes gleamed with the particular avarice that came from recognizing profitable spectacle. London crowds would pay handsomely to witness living wonders, they promised. Travelling fairs across England would compete for the privilege of displaying such marvels. Lady Isabel de Calne listened to these competing counsels with the desperate hunger of a woman who had prayed to every saint in the calendar for 10 years without result. Her barren womb had become the great tragedy of their marriage, a failure that echoed through the manor's empty nurseries. She stared at the messenger with eyes that saw not monsters or demons, but the answer to prayers that had grown heavy with repetition. Perhaps God had sent her children at last, even if they came wrapped in mystery rather than born from her own flesh. Sir Richard silenced them all with a gesture that carried the authority of one who had learned to read the deeper currents of political fortune. His decision, when it came, would echo through centuries, like a stone dropped into still water. These innocents, taken under his care, found shelter in his home, sustenance from his kitchens, and lessons in Christian ways designed to refashion wonders into the ordinary. But what he did not do spoke louder than his proclamation. He sent no word to the Abbey of Bury St. Edmunds, though its authority extended over all supernatural matters within their domain. He reported nothing to King Stephen's sheriff, though law demanded notification of any unusual occurrences that might threaten the realm's stability. He dispatched no messengers to learned scholars in Paris or Oxford, who might interpret such portents according to established theological principles. Whatever these children represented, miracle, curse, or something that transcended both categories, they would remain his mystery to control. In times when power shifted like sand beneath ambitious feet, the man who possessed genuine wonders possessed something more enduring than titles granted by kings who might be dead before Christmas. The calculation was pure Norman pragmatism dressed in Christian charity. These green children might prove valuable in ways not yet imagined. Their strangeness could serve purposes that conventional alliances could not fulfill. A lord who harbored living miracles commanded respect that extended beyond the reach of his sword arms. That evening, as torches flickered in the manor's towers, and the household settled into the rhythms of another day survived, guards took their positions outside the chamber where the children had been placed. The boy grew weaker with each passing hour, as though the very air of this world poisoned him with its unfamiliarity. His sister crouched beside him, her green-tinged hands stroking his fevered brow, while she sang in their water language, songs that made grown men weep without understanding why. Summoned from the village, the wise woman entered their room, and upon returning, carried troubled eyes and whispered judgments that raised more doubts than certainties. Their skin showed no sign of paint or dye, no trace of the herbs that mountain peoples sometimes used to mark their children for ritual purposes. The green seemed to emanate from within, as though their very blood carried the color of growing things. Their garments, such as they were, defied easy identification. The cloth felt like silk, but had the durability of well-woven wool. The stitching followed patterns that no seamstress in Suffolk recognized, though something about the designs suggested they might be meaningful to eyes trained in different traditions. More troubling still were the young ones themselves. Despite their obvious fear and the boys' growing weakness, they displayed none of the behaviors that marked foundlings abandoned by desperate parents. They showed no gratitude for shelter, no relief at being fed and clothed. Instead, they carried themselves with a dignity that seemed inherited rather than learned, as though they came from a place where children were accorded respect that English custom reserved for adults of proven worth. In the darkest hour before dawn, when even the guards nodded at their posts, strange sounds drifted from the tower chamber. Not the children's voices, but something else. A resonance that seemed to come from the stones themselves, as though the ancient walls remembered sounds they had heard in ages past. Some claimed later to have heard bells ringing in impossible harmonies, while others swore they caught fragments of conversations conducted in languages that predated human speech. Sir Richard, sleepless in his own chamber, listened to these disturbances with the patience of a man who understood that some investments required time to mature. Whatever power had delivered these children to his lands had also delivered an opportunity that careful management might transform into advantage that extended far beyond Suffolk's boundaries. By morning's light, the boy's condition had worsened, his green pallor fading toward the grey of old parchment. But his sister remained alert, her impossible eyes taking in details of her new surroundings, with the careful attention of one who expected to be tested on her observations. 3 days of desperate failure, stretched like a penance imposed by an unforgiving God. The children refused everything the household could offer. Fresh bread, blessed by the priest, and still warm from ovens that had never known want. honey milk drawn from cows that grazed on abbey lands, capons roasted with herbs that cost more than a peasant earned in a season. Each offering was met with the same response: wide green eyes that held no recognition, small heads that turned away as though the very scent of human food was poison to their otherworldly constitutions. Hour by hour the boy withered. The green sheen of his skin, once so brilliant and uncanny in the wolf pit, paled as if autumn frost had brushed it away. The color drained from him gradually, settling into the grey-green pallor of deep earth, of places where sunlight had never reached, of things that belonged to the realm of roots and buried stones, rather than the world of air and warmth. His breathing became labored, each inhalation a struggle that seemed to draw on reserves that were rapidly depleting. The girl never left his side, her small hands constantly stroking his face, his arms, his chest, as though she could somehow pour her own mysterious vitality into his failing form. She spoke to him constantly in their liquid tongue, words that seemed to flow like underground streams, carrying meanings that mortal ears could not decipher, but hearts could somehow understand. The household watched with growing alarm. The lady of the manor, who had borne and buried 3 children of her own, recognized the signs of approaching death with the expertise that only mothers could possess. The servants whispered in corners, crossing themselves and wondering aloud whether they harbored angels or demons, whether salvation or damnation would follow from their acts of charity. On the 4th morning, as the boy's breath rattled in his chest like autumn leaves stirred by November wind, a kitchen maid made her way to the tower chamber with yet another hopeless offering. She carried beans from the garden, common things meant for servants' pottage, still nestled in their green pods like secrets waiting to be revealed. She had no expectation of success, only the grim determination of one who would not surrender to despair while any possibility remained. The girl's reaction was immediate and startling. She cried out, not in her water tongue, but in pure human joy, the first truly recognizable sound she had made since emerging from the earth. Her eyes, which had held nothing but confusion and growing grief, blazed with sudden hope and desperate hunger. With trembling fingers that seemed to remember skills they had never learned, she broke open the pods. The beans within were ordinary things, no larger or stranger than any that grew in English soil, yet she handled them as though they were more precious than the abbey's golden reliquaries. She fed her brother first, her movements urgent but careful, coaxing him to open his lips and accept this gift from a world that had seemed determined to starve them. The boy's eyes fluttered open. His grey-green skin seemed to catch light that wasn't there, and for a moment, just a moment, colour bloomed in his cheeks like dawn touching distant hills. He ate the raw beans with mechanical precision, his body recognizing what his mind perhaps could not: salvation in its most humble form. Beans. Of all the foods that learned men might have prescribed, of all the delicacies that wealth could purchase or piety could bless, these children from another realm survived on the humblest fare known to Christian England. Beans, the food of peasants and penitents, of those who fasted and those who had no choice but to fast. Yet in every folklore, in every story whispered by women who ground grain and tended fires, beans held significance that transcended their earthly nature. They were the food of the dead in old tales, the crop that grew in fairy mounds where time moved differently, the bridge between worlds that should not meet. The Romans had forbidden them in their holiest temples, claiming they contained the souls of the departed. Celtic druids had used them in divination, reading the future in patterns that meant nothing to Roman eyes, but everything to those who remembered older truths. The household steward, a man who had served 3 lords and learned to read the meanings hidden in mundane things, ordered the entire bean garden harvested immediately. Every pod was gathered, every plant stripped bare, as though they raced against time itself. The children ate with desperate gratitude, their small fingers working constantly to shell the pods, their mouths stained green with juices that seemed to restore something essential to their alien natures. Slowly, carefully, they learned to accept other foods. First bread soaked in bean water, the familiar flavor bridging the gap between their world and this one. Then pottage made with beans and herbs, the mixture thick enough to fill bellies that had been empty too long. Eventually, cautiously, other foods that grew close to the earth, roots and turnips, onions that drew their strength from soil rather than sun, mushrooms that sprouted in dark places where different rules might apply. But what disturbed the watchers most deeply was not what the children would eat, but how they had known what to eat. The girl's instant recognition of the bean pods, her practiced movements as she broke them open, the way both children had fallen upon this humble food with the familiarity of long custom, all suggested a terrible truth that no one wanted to voice. Wherever these children had come from, beans grew there too. In that other world, beyond the wolf pits, beyond the boundaries of maps drawn by human hands, there were gardens where familiar plants sprouted from unfamiliar soil. There were harvests gathered by hands that glowed green in strange light. Meals shared by beings who knew the taste of foods that grew in both realms. The boundary between their world and this one was thinner than anyone had dared imagine. These were not visitors from some distant star or realm of pure spirit, but neighbors from a place so close that the same seeds could take root in both soils. The same crops could sustain life on either side of whatever barrier had been breached. As the children's color slowly began to return, not the vivid green of their arrival, but a softer hue that suggested adaptation rather than transformation, the household found itself confronting a question that would echo through the centuries. If these children could survive on English beans, what did that say about the nature of the world itself? In the tower chamber, where impossible visitors ate familiar food and slowly learned to live in a realm that was both foreign and strangely, troublingly familiar, the mystery deepened with every meal, every small victory over starvation, every sign that survival might indeed be possible. The secret of their salvation had been hidden in the humblest corner of the most ordinary garden, waiting for a servant girl brave enough to offer beans to creatures who defied every law of God and nature. Autumn brought the sweating sickness to Suffolk, as it had for 3 years running, though whispers in the village suggested this pestilence had arrived with passengers who should never have emerged from the earth's hidden places. The fever struck rich and poor alike, but it seemed to burn differently in the green boy, as though his strange flesh could not hold the same poisons that tormented ordinary mortals. He fought the sickness with words in his water tongue, reaching for shadows only he could perceive in the corners of Sir Richard's tower chamber. His small hands clutched at air, grasping for things that existed just beyond the visible world. Familiar shapes from a realm where his fevered mind still wandered, even as his body grew daily more pale, more translucent, like morning mist touched by the first rays of sun. The girl never left his side, curled against him like a cat seeking warmth, singing in their liquid language. Her songs made listeners weep without knowing why, melodies that seemed to flow from some deep well of sorrow that had no bottom. They sounded like bells heard through water, through earth, through impossible distances. Not the bronze voices of church towers that called the faithful to prayer, but something older, more fundamental. The music that might have played when the world was young, and the boundaries between realms had not yet hardened into the immutable laws that governed Christian lands. The lady of the manor brought holy relics with the desperation, of one who had bargained with God for 10 barren years and received only silence in return. A splinter of the true cross, small as a needle but worth a manor's yearly revenue, she pressed against the boy's burning forehead while speaking prayers in Latin she had learned phonetically, not understanding the words but trusting in their accumulated power. Water from the Jordan, carried back by crusaders who had waded in the same river where Christ himself had been baptized. She dripped between his lips that moved constantly in speech no earthly ear could comprehend. The boy's green eyes looked past this world toward another, their color fading like leaves touched by the first frost. Where once they had held the deep verdancy of forest pools, now they showed the pale translucence of winter ice, as though he was becoming something less substantial with each labored breath. Around his bed they lingered, one group relieving the next, their care tender as for any child near the end, yet troubled by the feeling that what was fading was not what had been received. Servants who had tended him for months found themselves unable to meet his gaze directly, as though looking too deeply into those dimming eyes might reveal truths about the nature of existence that human minds were not equipped to bear. On the feast of Saint Michael, when bells rang across all Christendom for the archangel who guards the doorways between worlds and weighs the souls of the departed, the boy spoke his first and last English word. The sound emerged from his throat like water breaking through a dam, shaped by a tongue that had learned new patterns of movement during his brief sojourn among mortals. Home. The word hung in the air of the tower chamber with the weight of infinite longing. Not the home where Sir Richard's charity had sheltered him, not any earthly dwelling built of stone and timber, but something else entirely. A place that existed in the spaces between heartbeats, in the pause between one breath and the next, in the moment when sleep takes hold and the familiar world dissolves into dreams that are more real than waking. He died as the sun touched the western horizon, his passing so gentle that those watching were not immediately certain he had gone. One moment his chest rose and fell with the shallow breathing that had sustained him through days of fever. And the next he was simply still, his face wearing an expression of such profound peace that several of the mourners found themselves envying rather than pitying his condition. But as his spirit departed, if spirit was the right word for whatever animating force had given life to flesh that was never quite mortal, his skin completed its transformation. The green that had marked him as other, as impossible, as a visitor from realms that had no names in any earthly tongue, faded entirely. For the first time since his emergence from the wolf pit, he looked like any English child who had lived too few summers and died too young. The priest who had struggled to categorize these strange visitors now faced a new theological puzzle: how to bury a being whose nature remained fundamentally mysterious. The boy had shown no response to Christian ritual during life, yet he had harmed no one, had spoken no blasphemies, had demonstrated nothing but the innocent confusion of the utterly displaced. They laid him to rest in the churchyard with the other village dead, though the priest added private prayers in languages older than Latin, older than memory, words he had learned from books that were themselves copies of texts whose origins stretched back to times when the world was wider, and the boundaries between the possible and impossible were drawn with more generous hands. At the graveside, the girl spoke in her language like running water, uttering pledges that felt heavier than death's divide. Her tone held the cadence of vows, of contracts made between souls rather than bodies, of commitments that would endure long after flesh had returned to earth. Then she turned toward the manor house and began the terrible work of learning to live as the sole ambassador from a realm that might have been a dream, a memory, or a place that existed only in the spaces between the known and unknowable. The brother who had shielded her in the wolf pit, who had been her connection to whatever world had birthed them both, was gone. Now she must make her way alone, in a land where the sun blazed too bright, where the food tasted of exile, where every word she learned in the local tongue took her one step further from the water language of home. That night, as the first winter wind rattled the shutters of Sir Richard's hall, some claimed to hear a child crying near the wolf pits. The sound rose from underground, they said, from chambers that no Christian foot had ever touched. But no one dared investigate, and by morning the crying had stopped, leaving only the memory of a voice that might have been calling farewell, or welcome, or something that had no translation in any mortal language. Though he was gone, the wonder and dread he embodied only thickened. In his absence, the impossible edged nearer to truth and nearer to horror. Winter locked Suffolk in silence, the kind of deep quiet that makes even the boldest souls whisper their prayers, lest they wake something better left sleeping. The girl, no longer nameless, for Lady Isabel had claimed her as daughter and christened her Agnes after the Virgin Martyr, learned English with the desperate hunger of one who understands that words are the only bridge between what was and what must be. Each syllable was a step away from her brother's grave, each phrase a small betrayal of the water language that had once been her mother tongue. Lady Isabel wrapped her new daughter in silks the colour of winter sky, and taught her the careful arts of Norman ladies, how to hold a cup without trembling, how to walk so that her feet made no sound on stone floors, how to lower her eyes when men spoke of matters beyond her understanding. Yet the servants whispered about finding Agnes standing naked in the snow behind the chapel, her breath misting in the frozen air, while her skin flickered with that familiar green tinge in the moonlight, speaking to voices only she could hear in a tongue that sounded like water running over stones. The steward found her there one February morning, her bare feet leaving no prints in snow that should have burned flesh from bone. When questioned, she would only smile, with lips blue from cold, and say she had been listening to her brother singing somewhere beneath the earth, somewhere beyond the reach of Christian bells and Norman stone. Spring arrived with its cascade of holy days, Candlemas giving way to Lady Day flowing into the great celebration of Christ's rising from the tomb. After the Easter feast, when wine had loosened tongues and warmed hearts in the great hall of Sir Richard's manor, when guests from neighbouring fiefs had gathered to share meat and gossip in equal measure, Agnes told her tale. She spoke in English now, though her accent carried something that no tutor could quite correct, a music that seemed to echo from the bottom of deep wells. The assembled lords and ladies leaned forward in their chairs, wine cups forgotten, as this strange child who had emerged from the earth painted pictures with words of a place that existed beyond the edges of any map. St. Martin's Land, she called it, where the sun never fully rose above the horizon, but hung always at twilight's edge, casting long shadows that revealed more than harsh noonlight ever could. There, she said, all people bore skin like hers, green as spring leaves, green as copper, left too long in rain, green as the heart of deep forests where no axe had ever bitten bark. They were Christians there, she insisted with the fervour of one defending her family's honour. They heard bells across the river of light that divided their realm from all others, bells that called the faithful to prayer, just as English bells did, though theirs rang with harmonies that spoke of mysteries English bronze could never voice. Their Christ walked among them in eternal twilight, his wounds glowing like stars in the perpetual dusk that was their noon. But then came the fatal day that changed everything. She and her brother had been tending cattle near the great river. creatures she described as unlike any beast known to Norman or Saxon herds, animals that seemed made of mist and starlight, whose milk flowed silver in wooden pails. The bells began to ring, but not their familiar bronze voices. These were different bells, brighter, sharper, calling from somewhere beyond their realm. Following that sound, they had walked along riverbanks that grew strange beneath their feet, the familiar path twisting into passages they had never seen, despite a lifetime spent in those fields. The sound drew them into a cave that breathed like a living thing, its walls pulsing with rhythms that matched their heartbeats, while the calling bells grew ever louder, ever more impossible to resist. The passage had narrowed until they crawled through darkness that lasted forever and an instant, through spaces that seemed too small for human bodies, yet somehow accommodated their desperate flight toward that blazing summons. Behind them, she said, and here her voice dropped to a whisper that made strong men lean closer. There had been others, many others. Her brother had not been alone when he first heard the bells. Dozens of their people had set out together, drawn by the same irresistible call that promised answers to questions they had never thought to ask. But the passage between worlds was treacherous, filled with turnings that led to nowhere and everywhere at once. Some had turned back when the darkness grew too thick to breathe. Others had chosen different paths at crossings, where stone corridors branched like the veins in leaves. Only she and her brother had emerged into this harsh realm, where the sun ruled like a tyrant, burning away the gentle twilight that was their natural element. The rest remained somewhere in the darkness between worlds, she said, still wandering, still following bells that called from a tomorrow that happened yesterday. Their voices joining in songs that echoed through passages that existed outside time. When pressed by the priest for more details about these lost companions, Agnes would only shake her head and speak of dreams where she heard familiar voices calling her name from directions that had no names, begging her to find the way back to passages that had closed behind her like wounds in the world's flesh. But it was what she said next that turned wine to ice in noble throats, that made even battle-hardened knights shift uncomfortably in their seats. The passage was still there, had always been there, would always be there. Sometimes, on quiet nights when the moon was dark and the English bells fell silent, she could hear her brother calling from it. Not calling for help, he was beyond all earthly aid now, but calling her home to a place that existed perpendicular to everything mortal minds could compass. That night, alone in the chamber, Lady Isabel had prepared with such loving care. Agnes told her husband-to-be the truth she had never spoken aloud. There had been no St. Martin's Land, or rather, St. Martin's Land was what her mind had created to contain something too vast for human words to hold. What she truly remembered was being everywhere and nowhere, being green the way light is green when filtered through deep water, being afraid with a terror that transcended all earthly fears, the fear of forgetting something infinitely important, something that would make sense of all the scattered pieces of existence if only she could remember what it was. The bells still called to her, she whispered in the darkness, not from St. Martin's Land, but from the spaces between heartbeats, from the pause between question and answer, from the moment when sleep takes hold and consciousness releases its grip on the world of solid things. Outside their window, February snow began to fall again, each flake unique and temporary, each one carrying its own small story from sky to earth before melting into the anonymity of spring's approach. The great abbey of Bury St. Edmunds finally stirred from its calculated indifference like a sleeping giant disturbed by stones thrown at its gates. Word of the Green Children had spread beyond Suffolk's borders, carried by merchants and pilgrims along the ancient roads that connected monastery to market town, traveling faster than any messenger on horseback. In Paris, scholars debated the theological implications. In Rome, cardinals whispered of signs and portents. In Canterbury, the archbishop himself demanded reports that never seemed to satisfy his growing concern. Abbot Ording could ignore the matter no longer. The pressure from above pressed down like the weight of centuries, while below, his own monks muttered questions that grew more pointed with each passing week. Why had the most powerful religious house in East Anglia remained silent when such wonders occurred within their very domain? What did their inactions suggest about their spiritual authority, their capacity to discern divine will from demonic deception? He sent his wisest brothers to examine this miracle or fraud, men whose learning encompassed not just the sacred texts, but the accumulated wisdom of ages, scholars who could recite Augustine and Aquinas with equal fluency, who had mastered the subtle arts of theological investigation that separated truth from elaborate fabrication. Brother Marcus, keeper of the abbey's scriptorium, arrived first at Sir Richard's manor. His pale hands, stained permanently with ink from decades of copying manuscripts, trembled slightly as he questioned Agnes through an interpreter, testing her responses against the vast catalogue of heresies and wonders stored in his memory. He spoke to her in Greek, the language of the Eastern Fathers, then in Hebrew, the tongue in which prophets had first heard God's voice. She understood none of it, responding only with puzzled smiles and tilted head. But when Brother Thomas, newly returned from the Holy Land, with dust of Jerusalem still in his sandals, addressed her in Aramaic, the very language Christ himself had spoken, something flickered in her green eyes. She did not understand the words, yet she began to speak in her original tongue, the liquid syllables flowing like water over stones worn smooth by time beyond counting. The old monk went pale as parchment, crossing himself with hands that shook like autumn leaves. Later, in the privacy of the manor's chapel, he would confess to his brothers that the girl's strange language had awakened memories he thought safely buried, fragments of something he had heard in dreams, or in the moments between sleeping and waking, when the boundaries of the world grew thin. It sounded, he whispered, like the language angels might have spoken before the Tower of Babel fell and confused the tongues of men. Brother Paul, practical and skeptical by nature, arrived with different theories and different tests. He had spent years ministering to the workers in the copper mines of Wales, where children laboured in darkness so complete that their skin took on a greenish pallor from the metal-laden air they breathed. Surely this explained everything. The girl was simply an escaped mine slave whose exotic story had grown in the telling, transformed by superstition and wishful thinking into something miraculous. But when he summoned the mine owners for questioning, their response shattered his comfortable explanation, like glass against stone. Yes, their child workers showed green discoloration from copper exposure, but nothing like what Agnes displayed. Their miner's green was dull, sickly, the colour of poison seeping through flesh. Hers had been luminous, as though light itself flowed beneath her skin. Moreover, none of their workers spoke unknown languages. Their tongues had been cut out years ago to prevent them from calling for help or teaching their harsh knowledge to others. Brother Thomas of Exeter, the abbey's expert on biblical prophecy and apocalyptic literature, arrived with scrolls that contained the accumulated wisdom of centuries regarding the lost tribes of Israel. Perhaps, he argued, these children represented descendants of those legendary peoples who had vanished into the earth's hidden places when Assyrian armies scattered them to the winds. The prophecies spoke of their eventual return, their emergence from underground kingdoms when the end times approached. He questioned Agnes about their customs, their laws, their understanding of divine will. Did they keep the Sabbath? Did they circumcise their males? Did they await the coming of a Messiah who would restore their people to their proper place in God's plan? Her answers satisfied none of his expectations. Their customs seemed neither Jewish nor properly Christian, belonging to some other category entirely that existed outside his theological framework. Yet it was Francis who carried the most troubling report. The Abbey's archives held records of such events reaching back through the centuries. Not many, not often, but enough to suggest a pattern that official church doctrine preferred not to acknowledge. Green children had been found before, in Scotland, in Wales, in the forests of Normandy. Always two, always brother and sister. Always the boy died while the girl survived. The chronicles recorded these events with careful neutrality, neither confirming nor denying their supernatural character. But between the lines, in margins filled with notes written by long-dead scribes, lay suggestions of deeper knowledge, references to doors that opened at certain times, to places where the world's fabric wore thin, to children who served as messengers between realms that should never touch. When the investigating brothers returned to Bury St. Edmunds, they brought with them questions that had no comfortable answers. Their final report, preserved in the Abbey's secret archives, was a masterpiece of ecclesiastical diplomacy, a wonder at Woolpit which may be true, or may be false, which may be divine, or may be earthly, which we record but do not interpret. This careful silence troubled Sir Richard more than any accusation could have. The Abbey knew something, or feared something, about what lay beneath Suffolk's seemingly peaceful earth. Their refusal to take a clear position suggested knowledge too dangerous to acknowledge, understanding too profound to share with secular authorities who lacked the theological training to handle such revelations responsibly. In private conversations with trusted advisors, Abbot Ording let slip fragments of deeper concern. The green children, he suggested, might represent something far more significant than isolated miracle or fraud. They might be harbingers of changes that would reshape the very foundations of Christian understanding, challenges to truths that had sustained the faithful for 1,000 years. Agnes herself, when questioned directly about her origins, offered new details that did nothing to clarify the mystery. In St. Martin's Land, she said, they mined copper too, but their copper was white and cold, and when struck with hammers forged from materials that had no earthly names, it rang like bells that could be heard across impossible distances. The Abbey's silence deepened as winter gave way to spring. No official pronouncement emerged from behind those ancient walls, no theological explanation that might comfort those who sought easy answers to impossible questions. The brothers returned to their copying and their prayers, their careful cultivation of vegetables that grew in properly earthly soil, their contemplation of mysteries that could be safely contained within accepted doctrine. But sometimes, when the wind was right and the night was still, pilgrims approaching the Abbey claimed they could hear strange music drifting from the scriptorium windows, harmonies that seemed to echo from the bottom of deep wells, melodies that spoke of realms where twilight reigned eternal, and bells rang with voices older than stone. As ever, the Abbey offered no answers, only silence. It was a silence that hinted certain truths were too immense for human keeping, too dangerous for human understanding. So the task was not to explain, but to record, not to solve, but to preserve, until some greater hand revealed what must be known. Years passed like seasons through a looking glass, each one transforming Agnes from curiosity into something far more dangerous, beauty. The green tinge had faded from her skin, as completely as morning mist vanishes before the risen sun, leaving behind a young woman who might have been born in any English manor, raised in any Norman hall, save for her eyes. They held depths where ordinary light disappeared, green as forest pools that had never reflected mortal faces, ancient in ways that made battle-tested knights look away when she smiled. By her 16th year, suitors arrived at Sir Richard's gates like pilgrims seeking holy relics, though what they hoped to touch was something far more earthly. They came from across the fractured realm, these ambitious men who saw in Agnes not just dowry prospects, but the kind of legend that could elevate a family name for generations. To wed the green child of Woolpit would be to bind oneself to mystery itself, to claim a place in stories that bards would sing when all other marriages had been forgotten. She declined each offer, but did so with such grace that rejection seemed a gift in itself. The Earl of Norfolk's son, heir to vast holdings that stretched from sea to fenland, received her polite refusal, while she arranged flowers in patterns that seemed to shift and breathe when viewed from the corners of one's eyes. A wealthy merchant from London, whose warehouses groaned with goods from Flanders and beyond, heard her gentle no, delivered in accented English that made his offers of silk and spices sound crude as a butcher hawking meat. Most disturbing was her smile during these interviews, an expression that suggested she saw through their skin to something beneath, something they themselves might not have recognized. When young Hugh de Clare, grandson of one of the Conqueror's companions, pressed his suit with particular ardor, Agnes tilted her head and asked in her water voice whether he truly wished to marry her, or merely to possess the story she carried like a dowry made of dreams. The suitor, who would finally breach her defenses, arrived from Lynn on a morning when spring rain turned the roads to streams and the very air seemed to shimmer with possibilities. Richard Barr came not as a lovesick boy or calculating fortune hunter, but as a royal official whose work carried him between the courts of Stephen and Matilda, threading diplomatic needles while both sides of the Civil War exhausted themselves toward an uncertain peace. He was a man who lived in the spaces between certainties, who understood that survival often depended on asking the right questions rather than believing comfortable answers. When he first saw Agnes in Sir Richard's hall, arranging dried herbs with movements that resembled ritual more than domestic chore, he did not stare at her beauty or calculate her inheritance. Instead, he watched her hands and wondered what songs they remembered, what prayers they still whispered to powers that had no names in any Christian tongue. Their courtship, if it could be called that, consisted of conversations that circled around the edge of impossible things, like wolves testing a campfire's warmth. He asked not about dowries, but about doors, not about lineage, but about bells that called across waters that reflected no earthly stars. She answered in metaphors that might have been memories, speaking of passages that existed perpendicular to ordinary geography, of journeys that began at the end and arrived at places that had never been destinations. When he finally asked for her hand, the proposal took the form of a question that chilled Sir Richard to his bones. "Will you show me the way back?" Agnes smiled then, with something that might have been relief, as though she had been waiting years for someone to ask the question that mattered. "There is no way back," she whispered, "only forward into places that have no maps." Their wedding brought together what remained of England's nobility after 2 decades of civil war. Lords who had switched sides so often they wore their loyalties like seasonal clothing. Ladies whose beauty was carved sharp by years of uncertainty. Knights whose scars told stories of battles fought for causes they could no longer remember. The ceremony took place in the chapel Sir Richard had built specifically for the occasion. its stones quarried from sites that local tradition claimed were older than Christianity, older than Rome, older than memory itself. Agnes wore silk the color of spring water touched by morning light, a gown that seemed to shimmer between green and silver as she moved. The fabric had been woven by craftsmen whose names were never recorded, using techniques that died with them, creating a garment that caught light in ways that defied the understanding of those who beheld it. Around her throat hung a collar of silver, worked into patterns that hurt to look at directly, designs that seemed to shift and flow like living water trapped in metal bonds. During the feast that followed, she told her story one final time in public, standing before the assembled nobles with wine cup raised like a ceremonial chalice. But this telling differed from all others in a detail that made strong men reach for their weapons and ladies cross themselves in the ancient way their grandmothers had taught them in secret. The passage was still there, she said, her voice carrying to every corner of the crowded hall. Had always been there, would always be there. Time meant nothing to spaces that existed outside time's dominion. Sometimes, on nights when English bells fell silent and the moon forgot to show her face, Agnes could hear her brother calling from depths that made the deepest wells seem shallow as puddles. He was not calling for rescue. Death had carried him beyond all earthly aid. He was calling her home to a place that existed in the pause between heartbeats, in the space between question and answer, in the moment when consciousness releases its grip on the world of solid things and allows itself to fall into mysteries too large for mortal understanding to contain. That night, in the marriage chamber, prepared with such elaborate care, she told Richard Barr the truth she had never spoken to priest or confessor, the reality too strange for any theological framework to accommodate. There had been no St. Martin's Land, because St. Martin's Land was everywhere and nowhere, a condition rather than a location, a way of being that existed perpendicular to ordinary existence. What she remembered was being green the way water is wet, the way fire is hot, the way sorrow is purple in the deep places where words lose their meaning. She remembered being afraid with a fear that transcended earthly terror, the fear of forgetting something infinitely precious, something that would explain everything if only she could remember what she had lost. Outside their window, night settled over Suffolk like a blanket woven from stars and shadows, and somewhere in the darkness, bells began to ring. Ralph of Coggeshall arrived 20 years after the emergence, when the Green Child ruled a prosperous household in Lynn, and her children showed no trace of their mother's strangeness except in their dreams, where they wandered through twilight landscapes that had no names in any earthly atlas. The chronicler came bearing letters of introduction from abbots and bishops, his saddlebags heavy with vellum and ink, his mind sharp with the hunger of one who believes truth can be captured in carefully chosen words. He wanted facts, dates that could be verified, places that could be visited, exact quotations that would allow future readers to judge the matter for themselves. Agnes provided them all, sitting in her solar with embroidery abandoned in her lap, speaking in the measured tones of one who had learned to present mystery as history, wonder as mere recollection. But as Ralph pressed for detail, something unsettling appeared. The more he repeated his questions, the more her answers altered, not through deceit, but as though memory itself were a tide forever reshaping the shore. The wolf pit had been 12 feet deep when first described, but 8 feet when he asked again a week later. The harvest had occurred in late August, according to her morning testimony, early September by afternoon's account. When Ralph questioned these inconsistencies, the woman smiled with the patience of one explaining color to the blind. Truth, she suggested, was not a thing that could be fixed in place like a butterfly pinned to board. Some truths were too large for single tellings, too complex for linear narrative. They required multiple approaches, different angles, the kind of patience that chroniclers trained in monastery schools rarely possessed. William of Newburgh wrote from the north, his letters arriving with the autumn rains that turned Yorkshire roads to rivers of mud. His questions were more pointed than Ralph's, informed by years of investigating supposed miracles that proved to be elaborate frauds designed to separate pilgrims from their purses. He had exposed false relics, debunked weeping statues, revealed the mundane explanations behind phenomena that had dazzled the credulous masses. She answered his written inquiries with meticulous care. Her responses dictated to a scribe whose hand trembled slightly as he recorded words that seemed to twist meaning, even as ink dried upon parchment. To William, she explained that the tunnel through which she and her brother had travelled was natural, a cave system carved by underground waters over countless centuries. Yet when Ralph asked the same question, she described passages built by Roman hands, their walls lined with stones fitted together with mathematical precision. A visiting Spanish scholar, drawn by rumours that had crossed the Pyrenees like migrating birds, received yet another version. There had been no tunnel at all, Agnes told him, through an interpreter whose Latin grew increasingly uncertain as the conversation progressed. There had been only a door that opened when stars aligned in patterns that occurred once per generation, a threshold that existed only when specific conditions transformed ordinary space into something permeable to impossible journeys. Both chroniclers noted something that disturbed their scholarly sensibilities more than outright contradiction would have. The green child was not lying. Of this they felt certain, with the instinct that comes from years of separating truth from fabrication. She believed absolutely in every version she provided, spoke each account with the conviction of one recounting events witnessed with her own eyes. Yet the accounts could not all be true, not in any universe governed by laws that reasonable men could accept. Ralph's investigations uncovered details that deepened rather than resolved the mystery. Other green children had been found, he learned through correspondence with monasteries across Christendom. Not many, not often, but enough to suggest patterns that challenged comfortable assumptions about the uniqueness of Woolpit's wonder. A green boy had appeared in the forests of Scotland 30 years earlier, speaking only in liquid syllables before dying of a wasting sickness that no physician could diagnose or cure. German chronicles mentioned green twins discovered in a Bavarian cave, children who claimed they came from behind the moon and vanished from a locked monastery cell, leaving only beans scattered across stone floors and the lingering scent of flowers that bloom only in dreams. Most disturbing were reports from Normandy, where green children had been found with disturbing regularity over the past century. Always two, always brother and sister. Always the boy died while the girls survived, to tell stories of lands where twilight reigned eternal and bells rang with voices older than bronze. The Norman accounts described features that matched the Woolpit survivor so precisely that Ralph wondered whether he was recording history or myth, documenting events or dreams shared across centuries by minds touched by the same impossible vision. William of Newburgh's northern sources provided fragments of even older stories. Celtic monks in Ireland preserved tales of green children who emerged from fairy mounds on feast days when the boundary between worlds grew thin as morning mist. Saxon chronicles mentioned similar phenomena, though their scribes had been more concerned with Danish raids than supernatural manifestations, recording such events with the brevity of men who had larger concerns than theological mysteries. The chronicles also recorded what they did not write, stories too strange for even medieval minds schooled in miracle and wonder. Ralph's private notes, preserved in margins never meant for other eyes, mentioned rumors that she aged differently from ordinary mortals, that her children were born knowing songs in languages that had no names, that Sir Richard de Calne, on his deathbed, claimed the woman had shown him the passage. But what he saw there had stolen his capacity for speech for 3 days. William's correspondence with fellow chroniclers revealed similar hesitations. They wrote of times when Agnes would stand motionless for hours, her eyes reflecting light that came from no visible source, her lips moving in silent conversation with presences that cast no shadows. They described how animals behaved strangely in her presence, dogs whimpering without cause, horses shying from paths she had walked, birds falling silent when she passed beneath their trees. Most troubling was the pattern both chroniclers detected in their research. The Green Children appeared during times of upheaval, wars, famines, plagues that tested human endurance beyond normal limits, as though the boundaries between worlds weakened when mortality pressed too heavily upon those who lived in the spaces between certainties, as though suffering opened doors that should remain forever closed. When pressed about these connections, she would only smile and say that pain made the world more honest about what it truly contained. Suffering stripped away comfortable illusions, revealed the cracks in reality's facade, through which other possibilities might glimpse the light of ordinary suns. In their final reports, both chroniclers chose careful neutrality over comfortable certainty. Ralph wrote of wonders that may be true or false, which we record without judgment for wiser men than ourselves to interpret. William noted phenomena that challenge understanding while demanding documentation, mysteries that grow larger rather than smaller when examined with scholarly attention. Still, in private writings, each confessed to strange dreams born of their search, lands of perpetual dusk where bells rang unending across luminous waters, endless passages twisting into everywhere and nowhere, and children's cries echoing from abysses that dwarf the deepest wells. The mystery remained, growing larger with each attempt to contain it within the boundaries of reasonable explanation. Truth, it seemed, was indeed too large for single tellings, too complex for chronicles written by men who believed that facts could be separated from wonder, that history could be divorced from the dreams that give it meaning. Agnes had become something more dangerous than miracle or fraud. She had become a question that grew larger each time someone tried to answer it, a story that changed in the telling until no one could remember which version had come first, or whether any version was more true than the dreams her presence inspired in those who tried to reduce mystery to mere words on parchment. Knights returned from fighting Saracens in the Holy Land, sought new quests in Suffolk's depths, their swords still stained with foreign blood, their minds haunted by visions of Jerusalem's golden dome and the impossible geometries of Damascus steel. The Crusades had taught them that the world contained wonders beyond European imagination, but they had not expected to find such mysteries buried beneath the familiar earth of their own shires. Sir Edmund of Rattlesden led 12 men into the caves beneath Bury St. Edmunds on the feast day of St. Michael, when the veil between worlds was said to grow thin as spider silk. They carried torches blessed by the abbot himself, ropes woven from hemp that had been sanctified through prayers spoken in the tongue Christ himself had used, and swords that bore the names of archangels etched into their steel by smiths who understood that some battles required more than mortal weapons. The caves ran deeper than any map suggested, their passages following underground rivers that flowed backward, upward, in directions that violated the natural order of water seeking its proper level. The limestone walls bore markings that hurt to perceive directly, not carved by human hands, but pressed into the stone by forces that left impressions like fingernails drag through soft clay. Only the clay was solid rock, and the fingers belonged to no earthly creature. In the deepest chamber, where their torchlight barely penetrated darkness that seemed to swallow illumination like a hungry mouth, they found beans growing in total absence of sun. The plants climbed impossible heights, their vines twisting through air with nothing to support them, their pods glowing with the same green luminescence that had once marked the strange children. When Sir Edmund reached out to touch them, his gauntleted hand passed through the vines, as though they were made of light and memory rather than earthly substance. Two men vanished in that chamber, Sir Geoffrey of Thetford and young Marcus the squire, both there one moment and gone the next, their voices echoing from places that could not be reached by rope or ladder or any means known to mortal exploration. For 7 days after, their calls could be heard rising from beneath the earth, behind the walls, above the vaulted ceiling, saying they had found it, found the door, found the river of light that led to realms where bells rang, with harmonies older than creation. Their voices spoke of wonders that made Jerusalem's splendor seem like children's toys. Cities built from crystallized music, gardens where flowers bloomed backwards into seed, libraries that contained every book that had ever been written and every book that never would be. They begged their companions to follow, to step through barriers that were only barriers to those who believed in the tyranny of ordinary space. On the 8th day, silence fell like a stone into deep water, leaving ripples of unease that spread through the remaining nights like plague through a crowded city. Their bodies were never recovered, though sometimes, in that deepest chamber, visitors would find fresh beans scattered across stone floors that had been swept clean moments before, and the lingering scent of flowers that bloomed only in dreams. The wolf pits themselves became a site of terrible pilgrimage. Desperate parents lowered sick children into their earthen depths, believing that proximity to the place where the green children had emerged might cure diseases that defied all earthly medicine. Some children returned changed, not green in their skin, but different in their eyes, speaking of bells and brothers they had never had, singing songs in languages their mothers had never taught them. Others did not return at all, though the ropes remained unbroken and the pit walls showed no marks of climbing or falling. These vanishings occurred in broad daylight, witnessed by multiple observers who swore the children had simply stepped sideways out of reality, there one moment and gone the next, as though they had remembered how to travel roads that led to places unmarked on any earthly map. The church sent investigators, learned men who recorded testimonies and measured distances, who brought holy relics and sacred oils to combat whatever forces had claimed these lost souls. But their crosses cast no shadows in the wolf pits. Their prayers echoed strangely in the depths, and more than one priest reported dreams, where green children called to them from places that existed in the pause between heartbeats. Agnes, when told of these searches and disappearances, would touch her heart with fingers that trembled like autumn leaves and say the seekers looked in the wrong direction. The passage was not down or up or north or south, she explained to those who pressed for guidance. It existed perpendicular to everything mortal minds could compass, the way Tuesday is perpendicular to the color blue, the way sorrow runs at angles to mathematics. Despite the gathering cost, the expeditions endured, propelled by that strange compulsion, known only to those who, having seen the impossible, are forever unsatisfied with anything less. They brought scholars who measured angles with instruments designed for earthly architecture, only to discover that the caves contained corners, where geometry broke down and parallel lines met in impossible convergences. They brought artists who tried to sketch the markings on the walls, but their drawings changed when viewed from different angles, shifting from meaningless scratches to symbols that conveyed meanings too large for human languages to contain. Some sketches showed blank parchment in morning light, but revealed detailed maps of otherworldly territories when examined by candle flame at midnight. The final expedition, led by a Templar knight who had survived the fall of Jerusalem and claimed he understood the true nature of sacred warfare, returned after only 2 hours underground. Of the 8 men who descended, only 3 emerged, and these spoke in whispers of chambers where time flowed like water, pooling in some places and rushing past in others, where they had aged years in moments, or watched seasons pass in single heartbeats. Whatever he had seen, he never spoke of it, but his hair had gone white as snow, and his eyes showed the hollow trace of one who had peered into abysses that looked back knowingly. He disbanded his order, gave his lands to the church, and spent his remaining days copying manuscripts in a scriptorium, where his trembling hands could find some purpose that did not require explanations he was no longer capable of providing. Though the church pronounced them sealed, the farmers whispered that the caves bowed to no mortal order. What had existed before men would endure after bishops had vanished into ash. And on certain nights of darkened moon and twisted wind, light stirred in the deeps, accompanied by the eerie sound of children at play in places where none belonged. Reports arrived with the disturbing frequency of plague bulletins, carried by merchants who spoke in hushed tones over ale-stained tables, by monks whose letters bore wax seals that trembled in candlelight, by pilgrims whose eyes held the hollow look of those who had witnessed wonders that challenged the very foundations of their faith. Green children found in wells in Wales, their water voices echoing up from depths that seemed to have no bottom. Green children discovered in the deep forests of France, speaking to the trees in languages that made leaves rustle out of season. Green children emerging from mountain caves in Spain, their skin glowing with that familiar luminescence that seemed to emanate from some inner light that had never known earthly fire. Always two, always brother and sister. Always the boy died while the girl survived, as though death itself followed patterns established in Suffolk's wolf pits, as though the cosmos had inscribed certain rules into the fabric of reality and would not be denied their proper observation. The accounts arrived from across Christendom with a consistency that troubled church authorities more than random occurrences would have. These were not isolated miracles or singular deceptions, but manifestations of something systematic, something that operated according to laws that existed outside theological understanding, yet demanded theological response. Brother Francis of Assisi wrote from his mountain retreat, describing green twins who had appeared in his monastery's garden, speaking of St. Martin's land in voices that sounded like water running over stones worn smooth by eternity. The boy had died within a fortnight, but not before teaching the brothers songs that made grown men weep for homes they had never seen, for losses they had never suffered. From Scotland came word of green children found near Loch Ness, where the dark waters held secrets older than Christianity. From Ireland, tales of emerald-skinned waifs discovered in fairy rings, speaking of the twilight country, where the sun never rose above the horizon, but hung always at the edge of dawn. From distant Bavaria, reports of green siblings who called their homeland the place between bells, where every moment rang with harmonies that human ears could barely comprehend. Most disturbing was the pattern scholars began to detect as they compiled these accounts in monastery libraries across Europe. Each one offered the same tale in essence, voiced in a language the others had never spoken, to audiences unaware of their counterparts. The details varied. Sometimes the land of origin was reached through caves, sometimes through doors that opened only when stars aligned in specific patterns, sometimes through passages that existed in the spaces between raindrops. But the core remained constant, a realm of eternal twilight, where all inhabitants bore green skin, where bells rang constantly across rivers of light, where Christ himself walked among the blessed in perpetual dusk that was more beautiful than any earthly dawn. The University of Paris convened a special council to address these phenomena, bringing together the greatest theological minds of the age to debate whether multiple worlds might exist layered like pages in a cosmic book, touching only at worn spots where the parchment had grown thin enough for words to bleed through from one page to another. Some argued these children represented proof of the spheres described by ancient philosophers, celestial realms that existed above the lunar sphere, where different laws governed the nature of time and substance. Others suggested they were refugees from purgatory itself, souls who had somehow escaped their appointed suffering to emerge in the world of the living with tales of intermediate states between damnation and salvation. But Agnes, when word of these multiplying appearances reached her household in Lynn, knew something the learned doctors did not. On a night when the moon was dark and her children slept dreamlessly in beds that had been blessed by priests who understood the power of salt and iron, she told her eldest daughter the truth she had never spoken aloud. There were never any others. Or rather, the green ones were always the same too, returning again and again across the ages, bound in a loop that stitched through centuries like thread through cloth, worked by hands beyond the reach of time. She and her brother were still in that cave, she whispered, had always been in that cave, would always be in that cave, following bells that rang from a tomorrow that had happened yesterday. Every appearance, every emergence, every death and survival was the same event viewed from different angles, the same story told in different languages to different audiences who believed they witnessed unique occurrences rather than echoes of a single impossible moment that rippled through time like stones cast into the still water of eternity. Her daughter, wise beyond her years in the way children of mystery often are, asked why God would permit such a thing, such endless repetition, such cosmic stuttering that trapped souls in patterns they could never break. Agnes laughed with the sound of bells heard underwater, of wind moving through chambers that existed in the spaces between thoughts. She had never mentioned God, she said, and perhaps that was the problem. Perhaps what they had encountered operated according to principles so alien to divine order that even the Almighty's attention could not penetrate the strange geometry of spaces that existed perpendicular to creation itself. The reports continued to arrive, carried by ravens that spoke in human voices, by merchants whose carts contained goods that existed only in memories of dreams, by pilgrims whose shadows fell in directions that defied the sun's position, in sky that might not be the same sky under which ordinary mortals lived their ordinary lives. Each new account added another layer to the mystery without providing answers, another thread to a tapestry whose pattern could only be glimpsed by minds willing to abandon the comfortable assumption that reality operated according to rules that human reason could fully comprehend. The green children multiplied across the medieval landscape like reflections in a shattered mirror, each fragment showing the same image from a slightly different angle, each appearance both identical and unique. Each emergence a question that grew larger rather than smaller, each time someone tried to provide an answer that would make the mystery manageable enough for mortal minds to contain. Agnes aged into a revered grandmother, her hair silver as moonlight reflected on green water. her face bearing lines that seemed to map territories that existed beyond the boundaries of any earthly geography. Her grandchildren gathered around her chair by the great hearth, begging for the story they knew by heart, yet somehow never fully understood, as though each telling revealed new chambers in a house they thought they had already explored completely. But she told them different versions now, her voice carrying harmonies that seemed to echo from the bottom of wells that had never been dug. Sometimes St. Martin's Land existed inside every growing thing, in the green heart of oak trees, in the emerald depths of spring grass, in the jade shadows that danced behind closed eyelids when sleep carried mortal consciousness toward realms where different laws governed the relationship between dreamer and dream. Other times, she spoke of it as the place numbers went when mathematicians stopped counting. That realm beyond infinity, where quantities became qualities and equations resolved into songs that could be heard only by those who had learned to listen with more than ears. Her youngest grandson, barely old enough to speak in full sentences, would nod gravely as though he recognized territories his rational mind had not yet been trained to dismiss as impossible. On winter evenings, when the wind howled across Suffolk, with voices that seemed to carry messages in languages older than Latin, she described St. Martin's Land as existing in the pause between heartbeats, in that infinitesimal moment when the blood stops flowing and consciousness hangs suspended between one breath and the next. Everything possible lived there, she whispered. All the choices never made, all the words never spoken, all the children who might have been born if their parents had met under different stars. She maintained rituals that disturbed even her most tolerant neighbors, practices that seemed to bridge the gap between Christian devotion and something far more ancient. Every harvest moon, servants would find her standing naked in her bean garden, her aged body somehow luminous in the silver light, her skin flickering with that familiar green tinge that had marked her childhood emergence from Suffolk's depths. She spoke to the earth in her water language, syllables that flowed like streams running over stones worn smooth by time beyond counting. The beans grew taller under her whispered words, their vines reaching heights that defied agricultural wisdom, their pods glowing within a light that made even the bravest servants cross themselves and hurry past the garden windows during her midnight communications. Her granddaughters learned songs from her lips that sounded older than England, melodies that seemed to carry within their notes the accumulated wisdom of ages when the world was wider and the boundaries between what was and what might be had been drawn with different hands using different instruments. When asked where she had learned these haunting airs, she would smile and say she was still learning them, would always be learning them, had learned them tomorrow in places that existed outside the tyranny of sequential time. Fever descended upon Lynn in 1179, born in the same ships that delivered fragrant goods from distant realms, an unseen pestilence that defied all medicine. Agnes tended the sick without fear, her touch cooling fevered brows, her songs easing the passage between life and death, for those whose time had come to cross thresholds that led to mysteries greater than mortal illness. The local priest, watching her move among the dying, with hands that seemed to channel healing from sources beyond theological understanding, asked how she had learned such arts. She touched his cheek with fingers that carried the coolness of deep wells, and said that in St. Martin's Land, everyone was always dying and always being born, so they had gained infinite practice at both transitions. But sometimes, especially during the dark hours before dawn, when honest dreams give way to visions too strange for daylight contemplation, servants found her standing at windows with palms pressed against the glass, whispering, "I'm sorry, I'm sorry, I'm sorry," in the water language that had been her mother tongue. When asked whom she addressed with such desperate apologies, she would point to her reflection and say, "The girl who stayed behind." Her children grew into adults whose dreams carried them to landscapes that had no names in any earthly atlas, who sometimes woke speaking words in languages they had never learned, but somehow understood completely. They aged differently than ordinary mortals, remaining vital and clear-minded, long past the years when their contemporaries had surrendered to the accumulated weight of mortal time. He became a merchant prince, the eldest, with ships always borne by gentle winds and filled with treasures no one could find except in the echo of their own remembering. Her daughters married into noble families across England, carrying with them dowries that seemed to include intangible gifts, the ability to see through deceptions, to understand the languages of animals, to know when storms approached days before clouds gathered on the horizon. Still, their heritage showed itself in subtle signs, discernible to those who knew how to watch. Their shadows fell in directions that sometimes defied the sun's position. Their reflections in still water occasionally showed faces that were not quite their own. Their children were born with an uncanny ability to find lost things and an uncomfortable tendency to speak of places they had never visited, as though they carried maps of impossible territories written in their bones. Agnes watched her lineage spread across England like ripples expanding outward from a stone cast into still water, each generation carrying forward something indefinable that connected them to mysteries their grandmother had brought from realms where twilight reigned eternal, and bells rang with voices older than creation. They were living bridges between worlds, she realized, though most would never understand the true nature of the inheritance that flowed through their veins like liquid starlight. The world was changing around them, growing smaller and more certain with each passing year, as scholars mapped territories and theologians categorized mysteries into acceptable and unacceptable categories. But in quiet moments, when rational thought loosened its grip on consciousness and allowed older forms of knowing to surface, her descendants still heard the bells calling from distances that could not be measured in miles, still felt the pull of passages that led to places where different laws governed the relationship between dreamer and dream. Agnes lay dying in the year of our Lord, 1189, as England transformed under Henry II's Iron Law and Richard the Lionheart prepared his armies for Jerusalem's golden walls. 3 generations surrounded her bed in the solar that had been her sanctuary for 40 years, but her eyes saw through their beloved faces to something else entirely, something that moved in the spaces between their words and breathed in the pauses between their prayers. She spoke to people who were not there in languages that had never been real, her voice carrying across distances that could not be measured in earthly miles. Sometimes she called to her brother in the water tongue that had been their childhood speech, her words flowing like streams over stones worn smooth by eternity. Other times she addressed presences that cast no shadows, beings whose names existed only in the syllables she whispered to air that shimmered with possibilities too fragile for mortal vision to sustain. The priest arrived with holy oils and sacred words, but Agnes waved him away with hands that trembled like autumn leaves in wind that blew from directions unmarked on any earthly compass. She had her own liturgy to complete, her own communion to receive from sources that predated the church by eons beyond counting. To her eldest son, the merchant whose ships always found favorable currents, she whispered the truth that would haunt his dreams until the day he joined her in whatever realm awaits those who carry impossible knowledge in their bones. She and her brother had not been from St. Martin's land, she said, her voice barely audible above the February wind that rattled windows with unusual persistence. They had been St. Martin's land, living doorways between what was and what might be, breathing passages that connected realms which should never have touched. When her brother died, half the door had closed forever, sealing pathways that led to territories whose names could only be spoken in languages that hurt mortal throats to pronounce. When she died, the rest would seal completely, and the worlds would be separate as nature intended, or as something intended, or as nothing intended, but simply happened, because the cosmos contains far more chaos than human minds prefer to acknowledge. Her youngest granddaughter, barely old enough to understand the weight of secrets too large for childhood comprehension, received whispered revelations that would shape her dreams for the rest of her unnaturally long life. Everyone was green beneath their skin, Agnes told her. Her words carried on breath that smelled of beans and spring water and flowers that bloomed only in memories of dreams. Everyone had emerged from somewhere else, had stepped through passages that led from impossible territories into the harsh light of ordinary existence. The difference was that most people forgot the journey, she explained, their memories smoothed and polished by the requirements of daily survival, until they believed they had always belonged to the world of solid things and sequential time. She and her brother had suffered the misfortune of remembering, of carrying within their minds maps of territories that existed perpendicular to everything mortal geography could contain. The local priest, arriving despite her earlier dismissal, performed the last rites with words that seemed to echo strangely in the death chamber, as though the familiar Latin phrases were being translated into meanings he had never intended. But Agnes spoke her own final prayers in the water language, syllables that made even the stone walls seem to pulse with rhythms that matched the failing beat of her ancient heart. Those who heard her final liturgy wept without understanding why, felt homesick for places they had never visited, experienced sudden longing for homes they had never seen. She held beans in her palm, like rosary beads, counting them in numbers that did not exist in any mathematical system developed by earthly scholars, whispering equations that resolved into songs only she could hear. Her husband Richard, aged beyond his years by decades of living with mystery incarnate, leaned close to catch her final words. She was not dying, she told him, her voice growing fainter with each syllable, yet somehow more distinct, as though distance was clarifying rather than obscuring her meaning. Death was simply another passage, another doorway between territories that existed in relationship to each other, according to laws too complex for mortal understanding. She asked for her children to bring her bean pods from the garden, where she had maintained her midnight vigils for so many years. The servants, terrified but obedient, returned with handfuls of pods that glowed with that familiar green luminescence, their inner light pulsing in rhythm with the dying woman's breathing. Agnes broke open the pods with fingers that had grown translucent as winter ice, feeding herself the green beans as she had on that first day when she emerged from Suffolk's depths. But these were different. They tasted of twilight and distant bells, of water that flowed upward and wind that blew from tomorrow into yesterday. Each bean she swallowed seemed to make her more transparent, more obviously a creature who belonged to territories where different laws governed the relationship between body and spirit. She died as the bells of St. Margaret's rang, vespers, their bronze voices calling the faithful to evening prayer. But witnesses swore they heard other bells responding, distant and underwater, underground and overwhelming, ringing changes that human ears could barely comprehend, yet somehow recognized as the sound of doors opening onto passages that led everywhere and nowhere at once. Her final breath misted in the February air and seemed to hang suspended like a question mark made of frost and starlight, dissipating slowly as though reluctant to surrender the last connection between her impossible life and the world of ordinary mortality that had sheltered her for so many years. Outside the death chamber, snow began to fall in patterns that defied meteorological explanation, each flake unique in its crystalline structure, yet somehow identical in the story it carried from sky to earth before melting into the anonymity of spring's inevitable approach. They buried Agnes beside her brother in the churchyard at Woolpit, though the grave diggers swore by all the saints that the boy's grave was empty when their spades broke the frozen earth. Had always been empty, would always be empty, as though death itself had forgotten to claim what belonged to territories beyond its jurisdiction. The soil yielded reluctantly to iron tools, releasing the scent of spring water and beans that should not have been growing in February's hard grip. That night, green lights danced above the wolf pits with a brilliance that made stars seem pale as candle flames, illuminating patterns in the sky that resembled nothing in any earthly bestiary, yet somehow conveyed meanings that bypassed rational thought and spoke directly to the portions of human consciousness that remembered when the world was wider and more wonderful than cartographers dared to map. Every bean plant in Suffolk flowered out of season, their blossoms opening in defiance of winter's authority, releasing fragrances that carried on February wind like messages written in a script composed of scent and memory. Children throughout the county woke screaming from dreams they could not describe, babbling about the beautiful lady made of bells who wanted them to follow her home to places that had no names in any language their parents had taught them. Her descendants prospered in ways that made careful observers uncomfortable, spreading across England like ripples expanding outward from stones cast into still water. They carried something indefinable in their blood, a quality that manifested in dreams deeper than ordinary sleep, in the ability to perceive colors that existed in the spaces between the recognized spectrum, in an uncomfortable tendency to understand languages they had never learned and remember places they had never visited. Some became visionaries, whose prophecies proved disturbingly accurate, though their predictions concerned matters that seemed trivial until events revealed their cosmic significance. Others went quietly mad, their minds unable to contain the impossible geometries they glimpsed when consciousness slipped between waking and sleeping, into territories where different laws governed the relationship between observer and observed. A few simply disappeared, leaving behind only the scent of fresh beans and the echo of bells that rang from directions unmarked on any earthly compass. Their families would search for years, following traces that led to crossroads where footprints ended abruptly, to riverbanks where clothing lay folded as though their owners had simply stepped out of garments that could not follow where they had chosen to go. The wolf pits partially filled with centuries of rain and wind-blown soil, but never completely, as though something beneath their depths prevented the earth from healing wounds that had been opened by forces too profound for natural processes to address. Local farmers avoided the area, especially during harvest season, when the moon rose full and strange, casting shadows that fell in directions that defied the sun's position, in skies that might not be entirely the same skies under which ordinary mortals conducted their ordinary business. Animals refused to graze near the ancient depressions, their instincts warning them away from grass that grew too green and too tall, from ground that sometimes pulsed with rhythms that matched no earthly heartbeat. Children dared each other to approach the edge during daylight hours, but always ran before reaching the rim, claiming they heard crying from below. Not the anguish of suffering, but the more disturbing sound of someone calling lovingly from depths that should have contained only darkness and old bones. The Abbey of Bury, St. Edmunds, added a curious entry to their official chronicle, written in the careful script of monks who understood that some truths were too dangerous for direct statement. The matter of the green children is concluded, though it never began. Let none seek what was never lost. Let none open what was never closed. The earth keeps its own counsel, as it always has, as it always will. Fragments of the tale survived in local lore, though each telling bent the details, fitting the impossible into shapes the tellers could recognize. The green children became fairy tales told to warn against wandering too far from home. Though the warnings carried undertones that suggested the real danger lay not in physical distance, but in spiritual proximity to territories where mortal souls might discover they belong to jurisdictions beyond earthly authority. Village priests blessed the wolf pits annually on St. Michael's Day, when the boundary between worlds was said to grow thin as spider silk. Their prayers were not requests for divine intervention, but acknowledgements that some mysteries were too large for human institutions to contain, too ancient for Christian theology to fully comprehend, too profound for any response except careful, respectful silence. The beans continued to grow wild around the pit's edges, their vines reaching impossible heights without visible means of support, their pods glowing faintly on moonless nights within a light that seemed to pulse in rhythm with forces that operated according to laws inscribed in languages older than Latin, older than Greek, older than any human tongue had ever attempted to speak the names of powers that governed the spaces between heartbeats. In the village church, medieval woodwork showed two small figures carved with obsessive detail, their faces turned not toward heaven, but toward each other, hands clasped as though promising never to let go despite the cosmic forces that sought to separate them. The carver had added something the chronicles never mentioned. Both children had roots instead of feet, tendrils that disappeared into carved earth, suggesting they had grown from the ground like strange fruit rather than arrived through any passage that mortal geography could accommodate. 8 centuries pass like the shadow of clouds across Suffolk fields, and the wolf pits remain. The world has changed beyond recognition since Agnes breathed her last. Kingdoms have risen and fallen. Languages have shifted like sand in the wind, and the old certainties have given way to new uncertainties clothed in different words. Yet in this corner of England, where the impossible first touched the everyday, something endures that transcends the rise and fall of empires, the coming and going of faiths, the endless human need to explain what cannot be contained within the boundaries of reasonable thought. Pilgrims still come, though they call themselves by different names now, and carry different tools for recording wonder. They seek traces of the mystery that once emerged from Suffolk earth, following paths worn smooth by centuries of seekers who believed that somewhere in these fields lay answers to questions they could not quite formulate, solutions to riddles written in languages older than words. On certain days, when Suffolk clouds gather in patterns that hurt to perceive directly, the very air seems to thicken with possibility. Bus tours pause at the viewing area, their guides reciting facts from laminated cards, while something vast and patient watches from spaces between the documented and the acknowledged, between the recorded and the real. In Woolpit's parish church, the medieval carving endures, 2 children forever turning toward each other, their wooden faces worn smooth by centuries of fingers that trace the lines where human features blend into something else entirely. Their clasped hands promise what words cannot, that some bonds transcend the boundaries between what is and what might be, between the world of solid things and territories that exist perpendicular to ordinary geography. Local children still play the game, though they call it by different names now. 2 stand in a circle, while the others chant rhymes that preserve fragments of older truths. Green children, where do you hide? Under the earth or the other side? Count the bells from 1 to 7. Find the door to green heaven. At 7, the enclosed pair tries to break free. Those who escape win. Those who remain are taken to St. Martin's Land until the next round. But sometimes, rarely, carefully, quietly, a child breaks through the circle and keeps running. running toward the wolf pits with eyes that reflect light from no visible source, running towards something only they can see. They are always caught before reaching the edge. Always. Except for the times they are not, and another family leaves Woolpit forever, and the village agrees without speaking never to mention that child again. The bells of St. Mary's Church ring the hours as they have for 800 years, their bronze voices calling faithful to prayers that echo in stone chambers blessed by generations of believers. And sometimes, if you know how to listen, if you carry green beneath your skin, if you remember what you never knew, if you dream in languages that have no names, you can hear other bells answering. Distant bells, impossible bells. Bells that ring from the spaces between heartbeats, from the pause between question and answer, from moments when consciousness releases its grip on certainty and allows itself to fall into mysteries too large for mortal understanding to contain. They call to those who carry the bloodline, scattered now across continents their ancestors could never have imagined. In New York, boardrooms and Amazon research stations, in London galleries and Tokyo laboratories, descendants of the Green Children sometimes pause in their modern lives and turn their heads as if hearing music from directions that have no names on any contemporary compass. The mystery remains. The door stays closed. The door stays open. Both. Neither. Forever. In the space between these contradictions, where logic breaks down and wonder begins, two children still follow bells that ring from tomorrow into yesterday, still seek the way home to places that exist only in the pause between one heartbeat and the next, still call to each other across distances that cannot be measured in miles or years, or any mathematics developed by minds that believe reality operates according to laws human reason can fully comprehend. The impossible came to Woolpit on an ordinary morning 8 centuries ago, and nothing has ever been ordinary since. Somewhere, in depths that make the deepest wells seem shallow as puddles on summer stones, in passages that connect everywhere to nowhere, in chambers where time flows like water pooling in some places and rushing past in others, the Green Children wait, still waiting, still calling, still finding their way home to territories where twilight reigns eternal, and bells ring with voices older than creation, older than memory, older than the first human throat that ever tried to speak the names of powers that govern the spaces between the solid world and the dreams that give it meaning. The story has no ending because it never had a beginning. Like light, like love, like the mystery itself, it simply is, was, and always will be, world without end.